In this video, we're going to be going back in time to review the Colt Police Positive and .38 Smith & Wesson. For many people that have fired these old pistols, there's a lot of nostalgia around them. This was the actual pistol for me that means a lot. It was carried by my grandfather for a number of decades from around the Great Depression on. And when you look at the history of this pistol itself, this series of Police Positive was introduced between 1928 and 1947. As I indicated before, this was the service pistol that my grandfather actually carried at the time. And it is chambered in what's called .38 Smith & Wesson, which we'll talk about in a moment, because that's different than the other .38 loads commonly referred to, especially the .30 Special. So what are some of the pros about this pistol? Well, at the time, it was a relatively inexpensive and affordable revolver to be able to purchase at the time. It wasn't as expensive or intricate as many of the other options that were out there at the time. And of course, police were not making that much money, so this was something that they could afford to carry and use. It is relatively lightweight as well. In fact, when you look in comparison to some of the other pistols that I have on the table today that would have been consideration both at the time and after, you'll see how affordable and how really small this actually was relative to many of the other options. So for example, when you look at the weight, the Police Positive only comes in about 1 pound and 4.5 ounces. So compare that, for example, to 1911s that, of course, were around at the time that came in at 2 pounds 3 ounces. And then following this, in the 70s and 80s, many of the police were carrying the Smith Model 66 K-frame, or the Cobras, which came in around 2 pounds 3 ounces. And then, of course, lately we've had these smaller versions of the Model 60s, which in many cases have the shorter barrels the detectives will carry. But even in the 3-inch version, it comes in at 1 pound 6.5 ounces. And then, of course, you now have the most common carried pistol, service pistol, which is the Glock 17, which unloaded comes in at 1 pound 6 ounces. So between all these options, it really is a lightweight version for what people had to carry at the time, which, as many of you know, if you carried a pistol in duty or work, even a couple ounces can make a big difference. Clearly it did back then as well. So what were some of the drawbacks to the pistol? Well, the first thing has to do with the actual caliber itself, which is the .38 Smith & Wesson, which I'll talk about in a moment. I commonly refer to this as the .38 slow and weak, simply because it has less power than even a standard issue .38 Special. There's also few options you can put onto the pistol as well. It's very hard, if at all, to find grips that you can use for this pistol. You also have a fixed sight system on this pistol as well, where the back sight is fixed, very similar to what you see in the evolution of the old Colt models. So very few options as well to kind of change up the gun itself. Now let's go into the caliber for a minute. As I alluded to earlier, it fires the .38 Smith & Wesson, which should not be confused for the .38 Special. And one of the biggest differences you're going to see is I have 3 of them lined up on the table here. The first one is the .38 Smith & Wesson, followed by the .38 Special, and then the .357 Magnum, which is one of my favorites. And the good news is, if you mistakenly buy the .38 Specials, and try to chamber them into the pistol, you're going to notice that they're just too long for the chambering, which is good because you don't want to make the mistake of firing those loads out of this pistol. The thing is, it's not well marked on the pistol. A lot of times they say Police Positive .38, but it won't really tell you anything more about the round. This load in general has less power than a .38 Special, which many today even argue that the .38 Special is a low-powered round. So for many of the standard rounds you're going to see, they typically clock in at less than 700 feet per second. There is a company out there called Buffalo Bore that does make a hot load for this round, this pistol that, according to their website, is safe to fire out of it. It fires close to around 1,000 feet per second. It has the same terminal ballistics, or is very similar to a standard .38 Special, and it is it's a hard cast flat nose bullet. So if you do need to fire a Police Positive for whatever reason, and you need something that has a good amount of stopping power, the Buffalo Bore option would probably be your best option to fire out of this pistol. It's a typical 6-shooter. One of the differences you're going to see between the Colts and the Smith & Wessons is the Smith & Wesson, in order to open the chamber, you push in on the button to open it up. But in the case with Colt, it actually is, they pull back on it. So it's not a push forward, but a pull back. It's one of the main differences between the Colts as well as the Smith & Wessons that you would typically see. Typical double action revolver, so you have double action as well as single action. As far as ergonomics, again, very lightweight as we showed earlier. It's one of the lightest weight options that we have on the table, but you don't need a lot of bulk to be able to fire the .38 Smith & Wesson because it's just not that powerful of a round. Therefore, you don't need heavier barrels and heavier chambers. This platform actually works really well. The other trade-off typically you'll see with lighter handguns is oftentimes you can feel the recoil more, but again, with such a low pressured round as the .38 Smith & Wesson, this is actually very enjoyable to shoot. It's easy to shoot, very low recoil. It has a 4-inch barrel on it. As far as takedown and cleaning, it's a typical revolver. I mean, you can pull the cylinder back, clean the barrel as well as the cylinder. Nothing special here. Because it's a typical revolver, it takes a little bit more time to clean these because they can get a lot dirtier when you're operating them. As far as accuracy, I did shoot a few things here, which I thought was kind of fun. So I shot my typical groupings at 30 feet and at 50 feet. I had one flyer on the 50 foot group, but the groupings weren't too bad. And then taking that out to 70 feet, I can see the groups that I fired here. And then I did a double action at 20 feet just to see how well I could do with the double action, which surprisingly for a light pistol actually did quite well. So in comparison, you know, how do these groupings compare, for example, to a Smith & Wesson Model 66, which was pretty much the next evolution of the service pistol? Well, you can see here, as far as how I fired them between the Colt Police Positive and the Smith & Wesson 66 K-frame, the 30 foot groups were actually pretty similar in what I was able to group. In fact, the 50 foot groups were even similar as well, with the exception of one of my flyers. And then if I want to compare the longer and shorter range shots, I'll do that here, where again I have the 70 foot shots with the Colt Police Positive compared to the 70 foot groupings with the Smith & Wesson Model 66. Again, not that big of a difference. And then finally, I did some double action shooting as well. And again, the groups are pretty similar. So, you know, for a pistol that is so lightweight and is arguably not as ergonomically sound as, for example, the Smith & Wesson Model 66 with the Hogue grips on it, it did fire actually a pretty respectable group. So the accuracy, believe it or not, was actually pretty good for what I was expecting out of the pistol. So what were the alternatives at the time? This is, of course, a newer version of a 1911, but the 1911s have been around since 1911. So certainly those were options that people could carry at the time. The evolution went to many of the Smith & Wesson and Colt and a number of people made revolvers up until about the 70s and 80s, when they started evolving into the Cobras and as well as the Smith & Wesson models. And of course today, which you'll commonly see in duty, which is the most common of which is the Glock 17. But as far as alternatives back then, this was a relatively underchambered round, but this was a round that was developed in 1877. So it was developed a long time ago for Smith & Wesson, and a lot of police carried these at the time. Which takes us to the utility. What is this pistol actually good for? Well, this is only good for personal defense and against two-legged predators. I would not take this out against any four-legged predators, simply because of the power of the pistol round. It is just not strong enough to be able to give yourself adequate protection. Because of that, I would refer to this round as being a fire and flee type round, making this weapon a fire and flee weapon, which means if you fire it, unless you have a really good strategic shot placed, you're probably going to end up wounding and not destroying what you're shooting, but it will give you time to get away. So it is a fire and flee weapon. So overall observations about this pistol, again, this goes way back for me. I got a lot of nostalgia for this pistol, but It is a good quality pistol for what it was, because back in the time it was a simple pistol that could be bought affordably for many people to use in service. My grandfather carried it for decades. I even have his holster here that he carried the pistol in as well, so it was very reminiscent in his old pictures of seeing pictures of Indiana Jones, for example. Very light recoil. It is actually fun to shoot. You might have to modify a little bit, but the sights, I tend to shoot a little bit high with it. But again, for what it is, I mean, it was just an excellent pistol. It's a fun piece of history to be able to shoot, and if you ever have a chance to pick one up and shoot one, I highly suggest doing that, as well as making a great collector's gun as well. So that is the review of the Colt Police Positive in .38 Smith & Wesson, going back in time. A little nostalgia on the table here today. Hope this helped. If you like our channel, please like us on Facebook, and thanks for watching.